In 1980, Rick Warren and his wife arrived in Orange County with just a vision and a Bible. Within decades, Saddleback exploded into a 30,000-strong megachurch, baptized 56,000 people, and trained 400,000 pastors worldwide, all while The Purpose-Driven Life sold 50 million copies. But almost overnight, that global empire lost its denomination and its founder, without scandal, without abuse, and without a financial collapse. What really caused the purpose-driven movement to unravel, and could it happen to your church? Rick Warren's strategy began with a clipboard and a simple question. Weeks after arriving in Orange County, he and Kay Warren knocked on doors, asking strangers why they did not go to church. The answers shaped every decision that followed. Instead of building a congregation around tradition, Warren built around the needs and preferences of the people he hoped to reach, people who did not even consider themselves religious. The Warrens' first Bible study gathered just 6 people in their small condo, but the plan was never to stay small. Warren created a detailed profile of his ideal attendee, Saddleback Sam. He imagined Sam as an overworked, family-focused professional, skeptical of religion, pressed for time, and looking for practical answers to life's problems. Every sermon topic, every program, even the parking lot design was filtered through this lens. On Easter Sunday, 1980, Saddleback held its first public service in a high school theater. 205 people showed up, most of them unchurched locals responding to direct invitations. Warren's approach was simple. Ask what people want, then deliver it. Sermons focused on stress, marriage, and finding purpose, using language that felt more like a friend's advice than a theological lecture. This method, survey first and message second, became Saddleback's operating system. Growth was measured not just by attendance, but by how well the church met the needs of people like Sam. From the beginning, Saddleback was less about defending doctrine and more about removing barriers. The DNA was clear. If it worked for the seeker, it worked for the church. Subscribe to see how the empire that trained hundreds of thousands of pastors around the world came crashing down. Saddleback's numbers rewrote the rules of American church growth. Within a generation, Sunday attendance surged past 30,000 across sprawling campuses in Southern California and new outposts from Berlin to Buenos Aires. Over 56,000 people lined up for baptism, each one a public declaration in a church where stories of changed lives became routine. The giving kept pace with the crowds. Saddleback claims $1 billion donated to Christian and humanitarian causes, fueled in part by Rick Warren's practice of giving away 90% of his own book royalties. Then came the book that made Warren a household name. The Purpose-Driven Life flew off shelves, selling more than 50 million copies and reaching readers in 137 languages. It was not just a bestseller, it was a movement. Churches everywhere launched 40-day campaigns, and the curriculum spread to 162 countries. More than 400,000 pastors trained under Warren's purpose-driven model, importing Saddleback's formulas for growth and mission into their own congregations. Warren's influence extended far beyond church walls. In 2009, he stood on the steps of the United States Capitol, delivering the invocation at President Barack Obama's inauguration. For many, Rick Warren was not just a pastor, he was America's pastor, shaping not only evangelical culture, but the public conversation about faith and purpose itself. Subscribe to see how the empire that trained hundreds of thousands of pastors around the world came crashing down. On April 5, 2013, Rick and Kay Warren's youngest son, Matthew, died by suicide at age 27 in his Mission Viejo home. For years, Matthew had battled severe depression and mental illness, a struggle Rick later described as unrelenting, even with access to the best doctors, counselors, and every prayer they could offer. The weekend after Matthew's death, the scheduled sermon at Saddleback was titled "Surviving Tough Times." Instead, the Warrens entered a season of private grief. Rick stepped away from preaching for 4 months, spending long hours each day alone, often in prayer, wrestling with loss. In interviews, he spoke plainly, "I cried every single day since Matthew died." Kay echoed the change in their lives, saying, "We are not the same people we were before Matthew died." Their pain became public. but so did their resolve. The Warrens began speaking out about mental health in the church, calling it the last taboo. They launched the Gathering on Mental Health and the Church, inviting pastors, clinicians, and families to confront stigma and support those suffering in silence. For many, this chapter revealed not just a leader, but a grieving father who refused to let heartbreak have the final word. Critics began sounding alarms long before Saddleback's public clash with the Southern Baptist Convention. In 2007, Reformed theologian Michael Horton appeared on CBS's 60 Minutes, where he called Rick Warren's message heresy and accused it of swapping the historic gospel for self-help and therapy. John MacArthur, in his book Ashamed of the Gospel, argued that the seeker-sensitive, user-friendly approach at churches like Saddleback was fundamentally incompatible with the New Testament pattern for the church. These voices were not isolated. For years, theologians and pastors warned that market-driven methods, surveying non-attenders, crafting sermons around stress or marriage, and shaping every part of church life to fit the preferences of Saddleback Sam were eroding doctrinal clarity. Critics pointed to the influence of Robert Schuller, whose positive thinking theology and focus on self-esteem had already reshaped American preaching. They argued that when comfort and practicality become the standard, the message itself is quietly rewritten. The debate moved from academic journals and conference stages into the DNA of Saddleback's ministry. What began as a strategy to reach outsiders was now being questioned as a slow drift away from the core of historic faith. Become an exclusive member and be part of the people who understand what's really happening in American Christianity. On Mother's Day 2021, Saddleback Church ordained 3 women, Liz Puffer, Cynthia Petty, and Katie Edwards, as pastors. The announcement was public, celebrated on social media, and defended by Rick Warren as a deliberate act of obedience to their reading of Scripture. For the Southern Baptist Convention, this was not a gray area. The Baptist faith and message, 2000 states that the office of pastor is limited to men as qualified by Scripture. The Credentials Committee began its inquiry. By February 2023, the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee ruled that Saddleback was no longer in friendly cooperation, citing the presence of a female teaching pastor as the reason. Rick Warren, now retired but still the church's founding figure, appealed directly to the annual meeting in New Orleans. Standing before 13,000 messengers, he pleaded, "I am not asking you to agree with my church. I am asking you to act like a Southern Baptist." The response was overwhelming. On the final ballot, 9,437 voted yes to expel, and only 1,212 voted no. That is 88.46%. Messengers also advanced a constitutional amendment, clarifying that only churches employing men as any kind of pastor or elder could remain in friendly cooperation. The line had been drawn, public, unmistakable, and final. Rick Warren's retirement in September 2022 handed Saddleback's pulpit to Andy Wood and his wife Stacy, with Stacy stepping in as teaching pastor. Their leadership became the new face of Saddleback. Their style was public, energetic, and presented as a partnership. That approach did more than change a few routines. It reshaped the church's identity. When the Southern Baptist Convention expelled the church, Stacy told the Associated Press she would continue serving as teaching pastor, undeterred by the denomination's decision. Andy publicly affirmed her role, saying that his wife has the spiritual gift of teaching and that people often tell him she is better than he is when it comes to preaching. Saddleback's public messaging struck a confident note. The church said it was grateful to share the moment with congregants and that their best days were ahead. Under Andy Wood, the men's ministry launched events that emphasized rites of passage and masculine identity, a sharp contrast with Rick Warren's seeker-friendly, broadly inclusive tone. Critics saw these moves as more than surface changes. They recognized a familiar arc: charismatic successors, concentrated power, and a willingness to redefine boundaries. Other megachurches have followed similar paths: Hillsong with Brian Houston, Mars Hill with Mark Driscoll, Willow Creek with Bill Hybels, and Gateway with Robert Morris. Each rose quickly, centralized leadership, and under pressure, unraveled. Saddleback's journey now fits within that broader pattern, and it raises serious questions. not just about personalities, but about the risks built into the megachurch model itself. Subscribe and help us keep making content that cuts through the noise and tells you what's really happening. Today, more than 400,000 pastors worldwide face a blueprint suddenly out of favor. When success becomes the measure of faithfulness, the line between growth and compromise blurs fast. The real test for every church is not size or fame. It is whether conviction survives when the crowds are gone. Join the conversation below.